Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradari Yasodanandana Braja Janaranjana Yamunatira Vanachari Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Kishore Kishori ki jai, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Marani ki jai, Gonitai ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So this morning we are reading from Canto 10, chapter 51, and the text is 48. Kalevaresmin gata kujya sanibe nirudamano naradeva iti aham Pritsorate pasya padati anikapair Gam paryatam svaganayan sandurmadam Kalevaresmin gata kujya sanibe Nirudamano naradeva iti aham Pritsorate pasva padati anikapair Gam paryatam svaganayan sadurmadam Kalevaresmin gata kujya sanibe Nirudamano naradeva iti aham Vitsorate pasya padati anikapair Gam paryatam svaganayan sadurmadam Please chant. Kalevaresmin gata kujya sanibe Nirudamano naradeva iti aham Vitsorate pasya padati anikapair Gam paryatam svaganayan sadurmadam Kalevaresmin gata kujya sanibe Nirudamano naradeva iti aham Ritsorate pasya padati anikapair Gam paryatam svaganayan sadurmadam. The word for word translation, kalevare, in the body. Asmin, this. Gata, a pot. Kujya, or a wall. Sanibe, which is like. Niruda, exaggerated. Mana, whose false identification. Naradeva, a god among men. King. Iti, thus, thinking myself. Aham, I. Vita, surrounded. Rata, by chariots. Vipa, elephants. Asya, horses. Padati, infantry, Anikapai, and generals, Gam, the earth, Padiyatan, traveling, Tab, you, Aganayan, not regarding seriously, Sudurmada, very much deluded by pride. And the translation for text 48 is as follows. This is King Muchukunda speaking. With deep arrogance, I took myself to be the body, which is a material object like a pot or a wall. Thinking myself a god among men, I traveled the earth, surrounded by my charioteers, elephants, cavalry, foot soldiers, and generals, disregarding you in my deluding pride. And no BBT purport, although there is a purport that I'll touch on from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. Om Jnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manopistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Tadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahaguna Ragutanam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakha Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinu Bando Jina Bando Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshvari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Panchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Romapada Swami Tinamine Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Tinamine Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Pashacha Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Okay. So, in this commentary of Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Muchukunda was expressing the following thought. So he's put it into the whole emotive component is present. So quoting from Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's commentary that this is King Muchukunda's thought. Due to identifying with this body, which is like a pot or a wall, Kuja, I have become badly intoxicated. I was very attached to material things. Thus, I wasted my time uselessly. Close quote. So this statement on the part of King Muchukunda, it reveals an understanding of the necessity for things to be in relation to Lord Krishna, just by virtue of the fact that he's saying that I was attached to material things implies his awareness of where attachment needs to lie. So he's understanding there's a necessity for things, to think of things in relation to Lord Krishna. And this understanding is implied by his denouncing his attachment to his body. He says, due to identifying with this body, which is like a pot or a wall, so he's denouncing the great value placed on the body. And hence he's also denouncing attachment to all material things. And Srila Prabhupada, he paints a progression that happens of coming to be situated in transcendental pure knowledge. So this is how Srila Prabhupada explains that there has to be a progression where one can come to this point. So the point that one wants to come to is that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the ultimate goal of spiritual realization. So this progression is such that, and I'm going to quote Srila Prabhupada, in the beginning of spiritual realization, while one is trying to give up one's attachment to materialism, there is some leaning towards impersonalism. But when one is further advanced, he can understand that there are activities in spiritual life, and that these activities constitute devotional service. Realizing this, he becomes attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead and surrenders to him. So it's an interesting thing. One finds that many persons perform rituals, and I'm familiar with some of them. And generally, in performing rituals, persons may not even be fully aware that they're actually trying to give up materialism, because the nature of rituals is that it's accompanied by a thought that if I perform this particular religious act, I'm going to actually receive this benefit. So it's sort of materialistic thinking, because it's like you're getting something in exchange for what you're giving. So it's a transaction. So it actually takes time for a person to come to the point where they're actually understanding, oh, there's actually some activities that one performs for the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and these activities are exclusively for his pleasure. That takes time to come to that point. I know a particular person that I have regular contact with who likes to receive pictures of the deities, but I don't dare say anything about devotional life because the person is very seriously attached to their ritualistic activities of performing fasting at certain times in order to get this health benefit, or fasting at a different time to get prosperity for the family. So there's not much interest yet in understanding that even the activities they're performing, it is eroding at materialistic thinking, although the materialistic thinking is there. Now, King Muchukunda has understood the usage of the body as something that's used to worship the lotus feet of the Lord. And he had stated earlier, this was his statement, so we know he has this understanding. This was him speaking. That person has an impure mind who, despite having somehow or other automatically obtained this rare and highly evolved human form of life, does not worship your lotus feet. So this was in the previous text, text 46. So I'm going to continue with Srila Prabhupada's breakdown of coming to a state of transcendental pure knowledge. He explains, Srila Prabhupada does, that when one has understood activities making up devotional service to Lord Krishna, then at that time, and this is how he puts it, one can understand that Lord Krishna's mercy is everything, that he is the cause of all causes, and that this material manifestation is not independent from him. So those two understandings come together once a person understands that there are activities you perform for the pleasure of Lord Krishna, so they're not that transactional kind of activity. One automatically comes to understand oh, Krishna is the cause of everything, and I'm actually dependent on his mercy, his kindness towards me. So even though King Muchukunda is painting a picture in this verse of having disregarded Lord Krishna, that's what he's saying. Because he's saying he traveled the earth surrounded by his charioteers, his elephants, his cavalry, his foot soldiers, his generals. By his understanding such activity as needing to be in relation to Lord Krishna, he's understanding that Lord Krishna's mercy is everything, as per Srila Prabhupada. He's understanding that. So you can see how King Muchukunda is expressing himself. It's just referencing Srila Prabhupada. You understand that it's a great devotee who's speaking. So it can be noted that actually, and this is an interesting thing, it's actually a king's duty to follow certain protocol. And that protocol, he has to display the trappings of his status, especially at important meetings, at gatherings, at negotiations. This is actually protocol for a king. So it's not unusual that he should be surrounded by his generals, his foot soldiers, his cavalry, his elephants, his infantry. And just as a sideline comment, a king should also surround himself, and this is coming from a nice compilation from the different scriptures that points to the protocol that a king has to follow. It's a book entitled The Way of Kings. By way of a side comment, a king should also surround himself with persons who resemble him in dress, physique, and form. Interesting, isn't it? He should dress in such a manner that he cannot be singled out in a crowd. So, of course, this is just an additional part. In more critical circumstances, he can even utilize disguise. So I found this very interesting to read because in our contemporary world, at least myself, because I grew up in a country that at least at the time of my birth was under British monarchy. So I'm very attuned to British monarchy. So an interesting thing is, like, recently there was the demise of the Queen of England, and it was known that she dressed in a way to stand out in a crowd. So she was always dressed in bright turquoise, bright yellow, bright coral, bright fuchsia, whatever it was always bright. But it's interesting, according to at least the Vedic way, kings were supposed to dress in a way that they blended in with the crowd, and in fact, even their generals could sort of resemble them in physique and stature, and I guess it was a safety measure. So that was an aside, but I thought it was interesting, so I'm just mentioning the aside. Now, in considering King Muchukunda's understanding of the highly evolved human form, Srila Prabhupada writes that when Lord Chaitanya was instructing Rupa Goswami in the science of devotional service, Lord Chaitanya discussed in some detail the material world and the living entities. And this is how Lord Chaitanya broke it down. He pointed out that among the 8,400,000 species of life, there are 900,000 species of aquatics, 2 million kinds of plants, 1,100,000 varieties of insects, 1 million species of birds, 3 million kinds of beasts, and just 400,000 species of humans. And particularly Homo sapiens are clearly in the minority. So this idea that it's a very highly evolved form of life, and it's a small percentage of the total number of living entities this 8,400,000 species of life. So just 400,000 are species of humans. This information was found, at least Srila Prabhupada's writing in his book Renunciation Through Wisdom. Now, in the same way that King Muchukunda equated an impure mind with one in the latter category, who does not worship the lotus feet of Lord Krishna, so Homo sapien, who doesn't worship the lotus feet of Krishna, he's equating with somebody who has an impure mind. So, of course, that's a distinguishing characteristic of somebody in the human species of life. There's the mind, the ego, the intelligence. And Srila Prabhupada goes further, and he divides humans into three categories. There's the uncivilized group, the half-civilized group, and the civilized group. I recall when I was studying archaeology, a lot of attention was given to one group of humans, so Homo sapiens, in the present time, that are still falling in the, I suppose, half-civilized group. So the country I was growing up had a portion of those Homo sapiens, the Bushmen. So in archaeology at university, we were looking at the fact that the Bushmen did rock paintings. So there were many caves where they did various paintings. And their paintings depicted actually forms of worship. So I recall their worshipable deity or form was a praying mantis. Now, praying mantises are very common in South Africa. It's a kind of locust, but they actually depicted that on their rock paintings. So some form of worship, but still falling into the category of half-civilized. And Srila Prabhupada in particular, he points out that in the civilized group are those who act without restraint and discipline. So one may be falling into the category of being a civilized person. So the Bushmen, they had like, one little garment wrapped around their body. They walked around with their spears. They were using minerals of the earth to paint in caves. They had their ritualistic trance activity that they did, worshipping some form that they perceived as like a worshipable form, this praying mantis. But the category that we're talking about, the civilized human beings, we're fully clothed. We actually go through a system of education. We live in nice homes. There's all the amenities, comfort, everything's very ordered. There's products that have been developed through human intelligence that allow one to function more efficiently. One doesn't have to go and build a fire out in the open in order to cook one's food stuff. One can actually, even in a contained space within a home, one has a little apparatus that allows for fire to be there, and you can actually cook your meal. It's like supposedly very civilized. But in that category, because of the presence of the mind, and of course there's the intelligence, which is supposed to be ruling the mind, and there's the ego, how one conceives of oneself, there's a problem. And Srila Prabhupada says that in that category of civilized persons are those who act without restraint and without discipline. In fact, you could say they're acting only for enjoyment. So the component of worship or the necessity for some kind of restraint of the senses is not present. And what results is that those entities within the category of civilized human beings, they create chaos for the rest of the civilized group of humans. So in relation to the term used by King Muchukunda of an impure mind, that's what he says is the problem. Srila Prabhupada states that on the subtle level, as soon as one thinks, I'm of a particular ethnicity, so one may think I'm American, or I'm Indian, or I'm French, or I'm Spanish, or I am this body. So it may not be so gross that one announces to oneself, I am this body, but it actually relates to the thinking one starts to have. And I'm going to touch on it just now, how it is that one is actually thinking, I'm this body. But then that is impure. Or to put it another way, it is a kind of impure egoism. It's how you think of yourself. And why it's called impure, of course, is because there's also pure egoism, and that is the egoism of King Muchukunda. I'm a servant of Lord Krishna. That's pure egoism, how you think of yourself. So the picture King Muchukunda paints is that of one who has his mind, his ego, and intelligence being materially contaminated. So this is the picture that King Muchukunda is painting. It's not himself, but he paints that picture of himself, how it looks externally. And he refers to it as an impure mind, and equivalent is being materially contaminated. So it means you looking from a material perspective, not from the spiritual perspective. And in actual fact, King Muchukunda is out of material contamination. And we understand that by the knowledge that he's expressing. In fact, the description of thinking or ego described by Srila Prabhupada for one who is out of material contamination is implied in King Muchukunda's prayers. This is that thinking as expressed by Srila Prabhupada, of seeing oneself as a servant of Krishna. So that's the pure thinking, the pure egoism. And this is how Srila Prabhupada puts it. So, you sort of condense all the thoughts that might be there, but it boils down to when one's seen oneself as a servant of Krishna, one is thinking, I'm a servant of Krishna. I shall act for Krishna. I shall live for Krishna. And this comes, Srila Prabhupada's breaking this down comes from a purport in the 7th canto, the 9th chapter, the 11th verse of Srimad Bhagavatam. So, of course, in stating that contamination is present, this is King Muchukunda. He's stating there's some contamination is present. So, if we look at it, you could say that there's a dissolution of the false ego that is taking place, because generally the male ego, it wants to take charge and it wants to lead. That's the male ego. It's just naturally there. And in particular, in King Muchukunda's case, it takes the form in relation to his subjects. So his ego is one, as with all male egos, wanting to lead, wanting to take charge. And of course, because he's in the position of a king, it's in relation to all his subjects. And indeed, a king, and this is again one of the protocols for a king must enable his people to perform their natural occupation for the benefit of others and as a glorification of God. That's actually a protocol for a king. Now, King Muchukunda, he expresses the material contamination of impurity by his expressing it this way. He says, the presence of deluding pride. These are his words. And that he took himself to be his body. So he's seeing for himself, he's seeing that there's material contamination, there's an impure mind. And Srila Prabhupada writes that it's the impure mind which thinks I'm this body. And that's what the picture King Muchakunda's painting. He's saying, I'm walking around like a god amongst men, surrounded by my cavalry, my infantry, my elephants, my foot soldiers. So Srila Prabhupada says that it's the impure mind which is thinking I'm this body, for the pure mind knows that one is not this body. So the conclusion Srila Prabhupada states is that it is the mind which is the root of all material designations. In fact, he explains that until the living entity is aloof, or he's able to, be detached from the association and contamination of the material world, the mind will be absorbed in such material things as death, as disease, as illusion, as attachment, as greed, as enmity. So that's a very, these words obviously hold so much. But as long as one is functioning in a sort of material way, there's impressions that are coming on the mind. So for instance, some illness comes to the body, the mind gets preoccupied with the disease, completely preoccupied. The mind, when one is getting old, the mind gets preoccupied with coming death. Or if one, and King Muchakunda touched on this a little earlier, if one has some family, the mind is preoccupied with one's attachment to the family. That's what the mind is dwelling on. And then in other cases, there may be that the mind is preoccupied with greed, wants to acquire a lot of things, or even enmity. I'm going to comment something because recently my husband and I looked at a video that was examining in retrospect the way the former president had functioned in his role as leader of a nation. And what emerges is a kind of enmity towards a system of democracy. So he did not like to have to work in cooperation with the egos of others, or other male, other woman leaders. His preference was to rule in a very autocratic kind of manner. So he actually showed enmity to the extent that he even publicly incited the subjects, the nation, the populace, to go and physically attack the building that housed all the leaders of the nation that were, working with him, or supposed to be working with him. He actually was willing to do that just by virtue of carrying this enmity. So that's an example of that kind of thing where the mind is very impure. Especially when you contrast it with the purity of mind that's required for somebody in that position, like just reading what the position of a king is, that there's facilitating persons to perform their occupational duty and just caring for one's subjects, so they can actually have the room to come to that state of having pure minds themselves, that they're doing their work to glorify God. So quite a different picture he presented. Now, the material things that absorb the mind are described by King Muchakunda here. So he looks at what's absorbing his mind: his charioteers, his elephants, his cavalry, his foot soldiers, his generals. And his thinking had been of seeing himself as a god among men. But notice, it's a person with knowledge, with transcendental knowledge. So even if he's being critical of the impurity in his mind of seeing himself as a god amongst men. He's carrying spiritual knowledge. He's able to be aloof from his functioning. He's observing it, as opposed to, directly acting on impurity in the mind, as I've just described with one of our former presidents. So the instruction given by Jad Bharat to King Rahu, I think my computer spelled it wrong, Rahuganat, I don't know. So this is the advice Jad Bharat gives to this king. He says, the soul's designation, the mind, is the cause of all tribulations in the material world. As long as this fact is unknown to the conditioned living entity, he has to accept the miserable condition of the material body and wander within this universe in different positions. Because the mind is affected by disease, lamentation, illusion, attachment, greed, and enmity, it creates bondage and a false sense of intimacy within this material world. So one can just see the huge effect that having an impure mind has, that one is forced to go into another situation and another situation and another situation within this material world. And in fact, one actually feels intimate with this material world, which shouldn't be the case. One should be detached from it, because one's focus is on purifying the mind and actually becoming attached to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, which uplifts one's whole functioning out of all these attachments, illusion, the greed, the enmity. So King Muchukunda acknowledges the way his mind is affected. And this is why that thought that Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur paints, due to identifying with a body which is like a pot or a wall, I have become badly intoxicated. And Srila Prabhupada particularly, he notes that persons who have forgotten Krishna are all intoxicated. And that is, they can't properly recognize anything. So it's quite interesting, when one is actually moves a little bit along the path of spiritual life, and one's mind gets not being so subject to all the impurity and the impressions, and hence all these emotional components that start to affect one's whole being, being attached, being greedy, having enmity. One can actually see that if one has a conversation with a person who's not practicing spiritual life, who's just functioning with their impure mind, the persons will just repeat the same behavior, and the behavior they repeat is whatever their attachment is, whatever's very prominent in the impure mind. So it may be their family attachments. Every time you may speak to a person who's not practicing spiritual life, somehow you feel like you've heard this conversation before, and you have, probably 6 times before, because the mind moves them to whatever there is very prominent in the mind. So it might be a family attachment. So they'll mention main components of their family life. Or it may be because the mind is more greedy, they may talk to you about material objects they're very eager to acquire. So it means that they can't properly recognize anything. They're not actually recognizing that they're driven by their greed, or they're driven by their attachment, or even that they're very repetitive in conversations with others. So this is King Muchukunda's concern. He's thinking that being a materially opulent person, he's intoxicated by his possessions. That's what he's commenting on himself through being a bit aloof and a little detached. And He describes himself, thinking myself a god among men, is a thought which he expresses as his having become badly intoxicated. So he's seen himself as having become intoxicated by his position. So he thinks he's not even seeing clearly. That's how he's talking about himself. Now, that this view of the impure mind is like the effect of an intoxicant implies that the intoxicant will wear off. And so too, the particular position that has its time limit. So there'll be a time limit for King Muchukunda to be in the position that he's in, his lifetime. So that intoxicant is going to wear off. And King Muchukunda adds the effect: I was very attached to material things, and thus I wasted my time uselessly. So you can see how in just this short verse, how he's putting across so much spiritual knowledge. He's understanding the effect. I was attached to material things, and thus I wasted my time uselessly. So the reason the time is wasted is because it's not allowing one to even recognize that there's a time limit for the position you're occupying. So you have to think beyond that. And the pure mind is attained by concentrating the mind on Krishna's form with his two hands carrying a flute. And this, concentrating one's mind in this way on the form of Krishna, is in fact the most confidential part of knowledge. And Krishna discloses this knowledge. He says, always think of me, become my devotee, worship me, and offer your homage unto me. Thus you will come to me without fail. I promise you this because you are my very dear friend. So there's a means to go past that impure mind, to go past all those attachments, that greed, that enmity, that illusion. Man mana bhava mad bhakta, mad yamam namaskuru, mam evasyasi, satyam te, pratijane priyo sime. So those are some thoughts on this particular verse. If there's anything to expand the discussion.
Thank you for your class. In-depth research and knowledge about the subject matter. The first thing that comes to mind for me is pretty subjective. Like you say, repetition and conversation. Sometimes you feel alone and you got to talk to yourself through someone else sometimes. But it's good to have people that can mirror your thoughts and see if they're pure or not, to understand if your thoughts are material or spiritual. So it's really good to have devotee association for that, to weigh those things in, because there's so much objection from the outside world. And I just wanted to thank you for the class and for speaking on this subject matter.
Oh, thank you. That's a very nice comment, that sometimes one needs to be able to hear how one's thoughts are actually coming across through verbalizing them to somebody else who's practicing spiritual life, because then it gives you a better understanding if you on the side of an impure mind or a pure mind. Yes, thank you. It's a very nice comment. Yeah, because actually one gets habituated to one's mind, because there are patterns already there. For many lifetimes, one's been carrying, one's accustomed to behaving in a certain way. One deals with others, and then a certain learning happens based on interactions with others, and then a pattern is created in the mind. So even in this lifetime, one doesn't know what one's fully carrying from previous lifetime, but obviously one's got put in a situation that reflects one's mental state when one's arriving in this lifetime. But even in this lifetime, the interaction with one's parents create a certain learning. You know, they deal with you in a certain way, so you learn certain things or you understand certain things, and that creates a pattern. So there's a learned pattern. So indeed, one can become very habituated to a certain way of thinking, a certain way of looking at things. Yeah. And of course, if you are expressing your mind or speaking your mind to a devotee, what you should get back is they're utilizing their intelligence to examine what you're saying. And then it allows your own intelligence to kick in, and you can examine, oh, yeah, that's just a pattern in the mind. Actually, it doesn't make so much sense. I'm in a different position now. I'm an adult. I view the world differently from being a child. So, you know, this needs to be looked at. Yeah.
I was thinking what you had said about intoxication. And, you know, like when I'm working and I realize, you know, that I'm really intoxicated by my work, you know. And, you know, it's interesting that you said that because, you know, we think, you know, I don't get high, I don't drink, I don't smoke. And, you know, but, you know, I get high for what I'm doing, and it causes me to, I go off into this zone, like, you know, that I forget about everything, and I'm just into this zone where I'm just working, and it's a real nice feeling, you know, like and I forget about Krishna too, you know. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, that even absorption in one's material work you know, seems sort of intoxicating. Well, part of being able to be absorbed in one's work is because one is already training one's mind in spiritual life. So it means that one already has a meditative mood. So in performing an activity, as long as one reminds oneself, you know, one's actually doing this for the pleasure of Krishna, then it's not unnatural to be absorbed in that work, because one's already training oneself, you know, meditating on Lord Krishna through one's chanting, through one's worship of the deities. So it's not necessarily a wrong thing. It's in fact natural, because the mind's already been trained to meditate in that way. So if you find yourself being absorbed in your work, it's not a bad thing. It's actually just part of your new reality. But of course, you can remind yourself before you begin that certainly this is something you're going to perform for Krishna's pleasure. So how beautiful it comes out, or your happiness in performing that work, you see it as an offering to Lord Krishna. You know, it's like everything you do, you're acting for him. Your work is worship of him. So, and that's what he's saying. Always think of me. Worship me. Offer your homage unto me. So the work is like that. It's part of that. You can't separate it. So it's not a bad thing to be very absorbed. It's wonderful. So it's not material. Well, thank you very much. If there's nothing else, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai.